That's right. He's great. Say hi to us. Let me know.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry to be using the microphone, but we're being webcast tonight. And so for those of you who want to watch this again, or you have friends or family or whoever that might want to watch this later on, we'll get it up on our city webpage or YouTube within a day or so. So good evening. My name is Jeff Bond. I'm the Community Development Director. I'm going to just introduce the outline of what we're doing this evening and then turn it over to our guests who will tell you a little bit about what they do and some perspectives on developing affordable housing in Albany. You'll have to forgive me. I know there is at least one other Oakland A's fan in the audience. And just to give you, if you're not a baseball fan, there's a playoff game. So you don't want to know the score? Okay, I won't say. You can record it and yeah. So we'll leave it at that. Again, my name is Jeff Bond. I am the Community Development Director. My colleagues, Anne Hersch and Claire Griffin and Isabel LeDuc there's Isabel and Claire, and there's Anne. And our general plan consultant, Barry Miller, who's not a staff person, but is almost at this point. After 15 or 16 City Council, Planning and Zoning Commission presentations, I think he's fitting in. Just briefly, we have been, as most of you know, been working on our housing elements over the last year. We've caught up on our old one. We're doing our new one now. And one of the things, that's been a really good exercise for the city. We're developing new policies and programs that we haven't had. But one of the frustrating things I think to some people about that is it's great that it lays the groundwork, but it doesn't actually guarantee that something will happen. And a lot of you have said in meetings, we really want to just make it happen. So this evening we have people who do this for a living, who make this kind of housing happen. And 3 of the 4 happen to be neighbors of yours, they're Albany residents. And so we have an opportunity to hear from people who are leaders in the field. As I've mentioned, we've got snacks in the back. I don't want to take them home. So please help yourselves to those. And I think the idea is that you'll get a presentation from our guests. We'll have a question and answer session for a while. Barry will be the moderator of the question and answer session. And then after that, kind of time to visit at the end, talk among yourselves. You might be able to grab one or more of our panelists if you want to continue a conversation about what you heard this evening or ask some more questions. And our goal is kind of to try to wrap up by the formal part of this by 8:30 or so, and maybe get everybody home by 9 o'clock so that they can watch the A's game. So unless there are any questions, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Janet Smithheimer. And I'll let Janet do the introductions for the rest.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So good evening. So my name is Janet Smithheimer, and I am an Albany resident. I'm also on the city's sustainability committee. And I'm also the managing principal of a consulting firm called BAE Urban Economics. We do a lot of work for the public sector, both in housing issues and economic development, all the way from plans to public-private partnership projects. And I'm really thrilled to be on this panel this evening. So I'm going to briefly introduce everyone, and then as they talk, they'll give you more information about themselves if it seems something they want to do. And I want to acknowledge Jeff and staff who put this great panel together for us. So thank you for inviting us. Great, good job. And I told Tom that he's the one who's not the Albany resident. So we're very blessed in Albany to have all of you who are great, engaged citizens, and a lot of us who work in this stuff. It's really an unusual kind of city that way. And hopefully Tom will feel like he's ready to move here after we're done. Anyway, so that's a bit about me. So just to introduce the panel formally, so we have Tom Liao, who's Deputy Community Development Director, City of San Leandro, and he'll be talking a little bit this evening about that city's experience. I think city staff and we thought it would be good for all of you to hear a little bit about another city in the East Bay with kind of a similar sort of urban pattern how they've managed to develop some really nice affordable housing projects. We're also really lucky to have Susan Friedland, an Albany resident, and but fairly new. And she is executive director of SAHA. That's actually a nonprofit development organization that's a merger a few years ago of two earlier organizations. One was satellite housing and one was affordable housing, I think associates. And I think now you just go by SAHA. And she is a nonprofit housing developer and does great projects. So she has a lot of really good things, I think, to tell us. And then to my left is, yes, he's my husband, but he's also Michael Smithheimer. He wears two hats. He is currently an adjunct and has been for many years at UC Berkeley in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and he teaches a housing, mostly affordable housing development studio, sort of at the end of the two-year graduate program. Those planning students in the graduate school who want to become employees of Susan's or other nonprofit developers take his class and do real projects. More about yours? Okay. And also he's retired now, but for many years he was the CFO and before that Director of Development of the John Stewart Company, which is a quite large company for-profit based in San Francisco, works all over California, that both develops affordable housing and then manages as a property manager a lot of nonprofit organizations, affordable housing, quite large on the management side, so I think you'll hear a little bit about that. I think that's pretty good. Welcome all. Next slide. So, oh, sorry, there's our names, so let's keep going. Next slide. So just to review what we thought we'd talk about a little bit with you, we're going to try to do this in about 40 minutes or less, is a little bit about what is affordable housing, what does it look like, what's the city's role, which Tom will be addressing in producing affordable housing, what does a developer need to move forward on a project, which Susan will talk about, and then what are some of the specific challenges in Albany trying to create some affordable housing. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit to set the stage here about what is affordable housing. I know some of you in the audience work in this or know about it. Others, this might be a little bit newer information. But really there's a range of affordable housing that gets produced in California, all the way from sort of serving the group with probably the most need and most immediate need are the homeless and at risk of homelessness, and that kind of housing is typically generally described as shelters, homeless shelters, and also transitional housing, which typically serves at risk of homeless or homeless for a short duration, can come with services, and usually has a sort of intention of graduating the tenants, the occupants, so that they can move to more permanent housing at some point. And then there's permanent affordable housing. We're going to talk mostly about permanent affordable housing tonight. That's pretty much the expertise in depth on this panel. But if you have questions about the other kinds, I work with all of it. I'm happy to talk about it too. Permanent affordable housing, you'll hear us talk about sort of categories, different ways, but generally permanent affordable housing can serve seniors, it can serve families. There's a term that some programs use called large families, so there can be different sizes of families that are served. It can serve single people. Often these projects go by different names, but they're called SROs, single room occupancy kinds of units for single people and small studios. And there are many kinds of special needs housing also that address physical or mental or emotional disabilities. And usually special needs housing, not always, but usually special needs housing will, even permanent housing will come with a set of services that meet the needs of the occupants. Just to talk a little bit more about permanent affordable housing, the way all of us tend to think about this is about where the funding comes from. The funding drives a lot of what you can do on a particular site in a particular location at a given point in time. So you hear all of these things talked about more this evening. And so we kind of always naturally gravitate towards what's the primary funding source because it shapes so much of what you can really build and when you can build it. And just to give you a quick sense of this, we're not going to talk about this category tonight, but unless there are questions, but a general category is what used to be called public housing. generally serves at what's called extremely low income, up to 30% of area median income. And generally the main funding sources for that category of permanent housing, not always, but generally, tend to come from the federal government. The next category up, if you will, in income is usually funded these days in California primarily, or as a main driver, by something called low-income housing tax credits. And that's the kind of housing that a lot of us work with a lot, I think most of your projects. Although there's a mix of funding sources, so I'm trying to keep this very simple. That generally serves what some people call the working poor, although that's a little bit of an outdated term. And that generally goes, by law, it goes up to 60% of area median income nationally, but in California, there's a lot of demand for a limited amount of these tax credits. And so in order to obtain the tax credits, which is a very complicated process, usually nonprofit housing developer who's in the lead needs to, what we call, be competitive and try to lower the top level of income being served. So I wrote 50%. In San Francisco, it's more like 45%, sometimes 40%. You can't get your credits unless you're really serving a lower income level at the very top of your project. And then there's a kind I just wanted to mention briefly called inclusionary housing. We're not going to talk about that much tonight, but that's the kind that we actually already have on the books in Albany. We have a 10% inclusionary requirement, and what inclusionary housing is, it's intended to, in market rate projects, to require those developers to commit to a certain percentage of the total units serving a specific lower income category. Sometimes it's framed as up to 80% of area median income, sometimes even higher. Most cities apply it to both market rate rental and market rate condo projects. And sometimes the regulations are written locally so that you go higher when it's a for sale unit, like a condo. We have a 10% inclusionary, and Jeff, you'll have to remind me what our AMI it is, because I don't know.
It's actually 15%.
I'm sorry, I'm
That's
out of
right.
date.
And half of those are for households that earn 50% of area median income, and the other half is for 80%. So it's a pretty strong
That's
program.
a pretty good one.
But there's a court ruling that has nullified the rental housing half of that.
We're not going to go there tonight. That'll be the next workshop on inclusion. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you, this is probably not that helpful for this audience, but sometimes it's important to sort of talk about the incomes of the people and who those people are. And I skipped that part tonight because I know all of you have already looked at this topic and are really interested in producing affordable housing. So that conversation is more for an audience who's sort of saying, do I really want this in my community? So I'm skipping the income discussion to save time, but I did want to show you just a couple examples, some local, some further away, so that you get a feel for what affordable housing, permanent affordable housing looks like. It can really look a lot of different ways. There's been an incredible amount of work, and Northern California, I have to say, is one of the leaders in the country on this topic, and there's some amazing architects and other folks all around Northern California who really have worked hard to change the image and upgrade the quality of this kind of housing. I'm actually working on a large project right now for New York City on inclusionary housing, and I was showing Michael this weekend when we were pulling pictures of projects, and the architects from here need to start working there. That's the way to say it, I think. Just not the same quality of project at all. But some of you might have seen that one on University Avenue. It was built wrapping around a 7-Eleven, and a lot of times people don't know that this is affordable housing. It's quite well done. You might not care for the design of that particular building so much, but you can see a lot of care and attention to detail. The West Berkeley one I pulled off your Saha site, I think. I don't know. I hope it's not a source point. We know. I know. It's a drawing. It will be built. It's gorgeous. And then Albany has one affordable housing project developed by a different nonprofit and managed by my husband's former company. It's called Creekside. It's on San Pablo. Hopefully you guys can recognize that one. Moving to San Francisco, this is a project I worked on. And I love that there's better pictures, but I thought I wanted to show you that you can do this behind some of the buildings that we have in Albany that are those old auto mechanic buildings that we still have some occupied. sometimes maybe borderline, not so much occupied, all up and down San Pablo. And, just to give some feel for how people have done this. The next one is Oakland. This one's a denser project. You can't really tell from the photograph, but quite interesting of a design and quite an architectural statement. The buildings are kind of wavy, and it's really a full-blown community. And then the final one is Sacramento, and I don't know that project personally, but I just thought it was kind of an interesting, different take on how to design something that's fairly dense but looks kind of interesting. So there you go. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over at this point. I'm going to sort of hopefully set the stage a little bit to segue into Tom to talk about how San Leandro has done this.
Great, thank you, Janet. Thank you all again for having me here. I guess one thing that the City of San Leandro shares in common with Albany is we share a general plan consultant, Barry Miller. So we're both I'm very appreciative of having him, I think. But just wanted to go through what we do to hopefully help get affordable housing built in our city. I've been there about 10 years. Prior to that, I was with the City of Daly City for a while as well. And then I'll follow with a few examples of recent projects that we've done. I think, as we mentioned, it sounds like you all, when we work a lot with the planning staff, with Jeff and Anne, and great staff. And planning, well, that's one thing, and it's not necessarily leading to not going to get things built all the time, but it's really important, and to emphasize that it really is the foundation, certainly for us as planners and city staff to be able to kind of promote the vision of the city to developers and others. Certainly the general plan, the housing element is extremely critical, laying down the goals and the key sites, inventory sites that you all want to see developed. In particular, other types of planning that really help too is if you do area plans, and I'm sure that you all have some there. I can say with our experience, we have 2 transit-oriented development or priority development areas in our city. One is in our downtown area near the BART station, and the other is along the major commercial and north-south corridor that we have called East 14th Street. And the reason why that's been particularly critical is the access to the regional and state and federal funds that now are prioritizing TOD developments. And again, that is helping to lure developers as well into our community. In addition, it's really important with the general plan, the housing element, as well as your local regulations and ordinances to have a sort of full-blown or multi-pronged housing approach, again, for staff, in addition to just new construction, but having other housing type services and programs and apartment rehab and renter services as well, home ownership programs. It all goes along towards promoting affordable housing in a relatively expensive area to live in. And in addition to, in the past, I know our city has done sort of community type planning efforts to make it sort of a fun effort for citizens to envision what they'd like to see on certain sites or areas of the city, and doing community activities and planning activities like charrettes or visioning type exercises have been also very helpful in focusing the citizens and the council on what they'd like to see developed in terms of affordable housing. Otherwise, the city, in our case, does not own a lot of property, and that may be the case with Albany as well. So oftentimes we do really rely on private and non-private developers. And we really hope that what we've laid down is a framework of flexibility and, just a very developable community for them to come in. We pride ourselves as a city too. You're a small city as well. We have very streamlined planning procedures. We're able to mobilize a lot of different departments and work with priority projects, including the affordable projects that you'll see in a little bit, to help get entitlements through and building permits approved as well. And I think that's something that, in addition to having money, developers also appreciate. And again, having the planning documents and the vision and the laid out opportunity sites that we focus on, when developers come in to talk with staff and planning staff in particular, we're able to kind of articulate which sites in particular we'd like to see developed as a priority, and having those specific plans. We can talk about the zoning for them, and we can get into some real detail and give them a sense of where we can help them streamline, or if we need to go higher or whatever. It's a good dialogue and a good foundation to have. Then once the developers are able to find the site, again, we work with them very closely to design it and take them through the planning process. We pride ourselves on walking them through that. We also encourage community meetings and community outreach. If it's a smaller project, we'll oftentimes just tell the developer to go out to the community themselves and meet with them and get the feedback they need. If it's a larger, more high-profile affordable project, then of course the city will initiate some of those community meetings and probably have a couple or a few of those. In terms of a financing plan too, again, we sit down with the developer, but ultimately we as a city rely on the developer for coming up with that. We help them where we can. It's important that we have our affordable housing pot of money. With redevelopment being eliminated, that's a huge loss for cities, certainly for our city as well. We have a fair amount of HUD funds, but it's been declining over the years. And we have a local trust fund as well. And then, after that, we try to get them through the building permit process into construction. The last point I'd make again, and I know we have Michael here and Susan, certainly the development side and bringing the project forward to get approvals is really important and oftentimes the key. It's very sexy and to show them a great project and a great product. But ultimately, what we feel has made affordable housing successful and what has convinced the NIMBYs in our community since I've been there over 10 years is really the property management, the backside, the people who do the work day to day and maintain those properties. That's really helped convince a lot of people, in my opinion, that what really good affordable housing looks like. It blends right in. The first example I was going to show you is a former motel. It's called the Islander Motel. There's a few of these around the Bay Area. And so we had one on East 14th Street when I first arrived in 2004. It had basically been built in the early 70s, as you can see on the top in the style of architecture, and it sort of become a blight already in the early mid-80s. And the city had already done some community charrettes around it, even though it was still a functioning motel. But the year before I came, there was actually a murder there, and I think that was the last straw for our city council. So they basically gave staff permission, and we still have redevelopment funds, to go ahead and talk with the landlord, the owner, to purchase it. And for years he had resisted, and for some reason at that time, I think there were some family issues. He finally was aligned to or willing to sell, and that was a good in for us. So we were able to purchase the property as a redevelopment agency. And this is an example I put up here fairly quickly to explain it, of a city-controlled project. We don't have a lot of those, but we bought the land. We were able to envision that we wanted it to be affordable housing. We didn't request for qualifications for developers, and we got multiple applications in. We finally picked Mercy Housing California and San Francisco. But that, we've retained ownership, so we are the long-term owner, but we have a long-term lease. But ultimately, this was a project the city could control, and we were, as you can see with the bottom, we have Kavamasi architects designing that, give it a whole different modern look.
That was a rehab of the hotel, right?
It was an acquisition rehab, but
And it
we
looks
could
like
actually
you added also to it.
Right. Well, the units themselves were all studio units. So the nice thing was, we basically converted them all. They were studios, 450 square feet, pretty good size. So we were able to, make that work. We didn't. It was just but it was in such poor condition that we pretty much stripped it down. It was almost like doing new construction. The second project I wanted to bring on, this was more typical. We worked with Eden Housing in Hayward, and it's along our East 14th South Area Strategy, TOD, zone. And this is a site that had been looked at for housing, market and affordable. Community sort of resisted, but Eden kind of came upon it, asked us about it. We gave them kind of the history of the project, that a lot of the people didn't like what was proposed before, which was family housing, maybe even a little higher density. And ultimately, again, this was an opportunity site, though, in our housing element and in our South Area plan. Eden came upon the idea that they were going to do senior housing instead, and we hadn't done that in a while. And I think that was something they learned from the past failures of other developers. They came in with a good plan, very organized. This was actually also an example of, we had multiple pots of money as the city, redevelopment, HUD funds, local housing trust fund. So we were able to put that into the project as well to make that work. So this is actually a relatively smooth project, also given that it was senior housing. And overall, it provided 50 units of affordable housing for very low-income seniors. It was done in about 2010. And the final project is one that we're still working on, and it's in our downtown TOD area. We adopted a downtown TOD strategy that's been very well received. It was adopted in 2007, but as you know, the economic recession hit in 2008, or a little bit thereafter. Upon the adoption of our plan, we had a private developer who owned property near the BART station and Bridge Housing. They came in together to do a master planned, large-scale mixed income housing development of something close to 700 units in multiple phases. But as the economy started getting worse, they started ratcheting down the goals and were focused on just a phase one. And so, you know, this was a project that I call a good example of a survivor of the recession and how it's weathered through. Our city council refers to it as the cat with 9 lives. I call it the Phoenix or the Lazarus project because it has literally died and come alive and died at least a couple times since I've been there since 2008. But ultimately, you know, again, the traction here for the developers, I think, was the TOD opportunities. Again, by us creating a TOD plan downtown, we were able to access a lot of money to do improvements on the boulevard there, San Leandro Boulevard. Also access funding, state funding, Prop 1C, $20 million for infrastructure related to the housing component, which Bridge has been able to keep, and that's going to provide an underground parking lot. So that property is actually on a BART parking lot right now. So BART is actually the landlord for the Bridge project. And we're going to build 2 levels of underground replacement BART parking as well as shared parking for the residents. And so again, this is what I call creative planning and financing. Oh yes, and I'm sorry, just thanks Mary, I'm sorry for the acronyms here. Transit-oriented development, if you all are somewhat familiar or not, that's the term, you know, you've seen as sustainable development, you know, smart growth. Again, the big thing now around the country, and particularly in urban areas, is to promote higher density housing and you know, development along transit nodes, to promote public transit use and you know, promote higher density with housing, jobs, putting them all closer. So that's part of what the transit-oriented development is. So again, I'm sorry for just throwing out the acronyms. But this is a case of what we call creative planning and financing, because it went from a mixed income residential development in 2010, we actually had to kind of step aside because the private developer could not make the market rate housing work. Bridge was actually ready to go. It took about a year and a half to rethink this project. And what happened was the private developer owned property on the east side. This is on the west side. They flipped sites. Bridge was able to retain the approved planning entitlements, and they did some redesign to make it actually a much nicer looking project. The private developer in 2012 decided that the office market was better bet because we have actually installed a fiber optic loop around the city. So they're going to create a high-rise tech campus around the other side of the BART station. And Bridge reimagined this one, and they came up with a family component, which is the 115 units, and then 85 units in phase 2 of a senior. And that was what we call the creative financing plan that they had, because now by bifurcating the two, they've come up with 2 ways to finance the project more feasibly. I think Bridge deserves a lot of the credit for thinking out of the box and coming up with that to keep this project going, because we were pretty much run into the ground during the recession. And with that, they've been able to leverage multiple funding sources. So we put in over $9 million of former redevelopment money. They were able to get a grant of $20 million from the state. And some other funding sources as well. And let me also mention that a couple key obstacles that we faced was the end of redevelopment. The state came in 2011 to say, question our 2009 loan to the Bridge Housing Project, and they wanted to try to take it. So we actually sued them, and before we went to court, and this is sort of the state's MO, before we went to court, we had a settlement and we won. And we were able to keep the money in the project. So that's part of the challenge of keeping this project alive. And it's expected to begin construction in December. So they did get tax credits in June, and so this is one that we're hoping that will be done in spring of 2016, and hopefully you all will be, able to come by in a year and a half or two and see that. So
much. That was great for me because I actually was part of the plan that created
Right.
all of that, our firms. That's so cool. I'm
So
thinking
it's
to
the
myself.
those are the first major projects under that plan, so.
Yeah. Okay, Susan, take it away.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Friedland. I'm the director of a nonprofit organization called Satellite Affordable Housing Associates. Is the mic really loud, or is this fine?
It's good.
So we are a nonprofit that builds, owns, manages affordable housing and also provides supportive services to our residents. We have 2,700 homes in our portfolio that we've developed and managed. And we serve low-income households, seniors, people with special needs, and there's a few special populations that we provide housing for, including transition-age youth. These are young people exiting the foster care system, homeless individuals, people with mental illness, and other disabilities. So we have a very diverse group of tenants, most of whom earn less than a third of the area median income. So our average tenant earns, $10,000, that household will earn somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000. So that's who we serve. We have some units for folks earning $45,000 or $50,000. So we do have working families, but I would say about the majority of our residents are on some kind of fixed income, particularly the seniors. And as you all know, and that's why you're here, the housing market is, we're at a crisis. We recently completed a building with 100 units, and we had almost 4,000 applicants. So the demand is huge. The benefit of living in affordable housing is that you're housed, and you can use the money that you would otherwise pay for exorbitant rent to buy books for your kids and groceries and live. So, we see housing as a real basic human right and something where there's a just gross mismatch between supply in our region and the demand. So I guess why I'm here today is to talk practically about, well, how do we actually build it? And then we're going to have an example of a potential site we're going to have an example of how it would happen in Albany. But I'm going to focus a little more generally on what our approach is as a nonprofit developer. We've been around 45 years, and we've seen things change and ebb and flow. 45 years ago, the primary owner and developer of affordable housing was the federal government, and Janet talked a little bit about public housing. During the 70s, there was kind of a shift in mentality that the federal government maybe should get out of the business of building affordable housing. They still owned this huge public housing stock, but they started shifting dollars and programs towards having local organizations and even individual investors create affordable housing and manage it. Over time, the predominance of federal funding for affordable housing has dwindled to like a trickle, and other mechanisms have kind of come up and gone down and come up and gone down. We're in a period now of tremendous scarcity of resources for affordable housing, and I'll talk a little bit about that maybe in conclusion. So I would say as a framework, the way we approach housing development, affordable housing development, is that there has to be an intersection between a community need and a real estate opportunity. So on the one hand, our work is social justice, and it's all about equity and providing housing for people who need it. But on the other hand, it's nitty-gritty real estate development. So we need a site, we need money, we need permits, we need an architect, we need a contractor. It is real estate development as much as it is about social justice. So when we look at sites, how do we find sites for affordable housing? I get asked this question all the time. And I would say it's a real variety of ways. There's no one way. So sometimes we buy sites. So we use a broker, and there's a gas station that's for sale, or an empty parcel, or even a building that's been vacated or is existing. So we look at sites on the private market. That's one way. Another way is city-owned sites. This is ideal. If there's a city that's had the foresight, like San Leandro, to use their money and be really strategic and buy off the private market or repurpose an existing city-owned parcel, issue a request for proposals, that's fabulous. And we have worked with cities all over the Bay Area, from Oakland to Sonoma, to Sebastopol, to Walnut Creek, that did just that. They had the foresight and vision to purchase a piece of property, and they put out a call, and the nonprofits compete who has the best idea, and then we're selected. The nice thing about that is that we don't have to come up with the money to buy the site, so that's great. Another way is through sort of a friendly seller. So sometimes we have opportunities where there's a church with a parking lot that's big, or a nonprofit that has a large campus that really has a vision to create affordable housing. And I see Susan Moffett in the crowd here, and we used to work together, and there's a wonderful example of a 100-year-old organization in Oakland called the Fred Finch Youth Center, and they have this beautiful campus with the former orphanage, and they provide a lot of resident social services, and they wanted to partner with us to build some affordable housing on this multi-acre campus that they own. This is rare, but it does happen. And then sort of the last way, which is, I would say, a smaller percentage, is of foreclosure. So we have purchased properties through foreclosure. There was a small moment in time where the federal government had a lot of recovery and stimulus money that they issued out, so that some nonprofits were able to purchase small apartment buildings, foreclosed apartment buildings, or even vacant sites that had been foreclosed on. That opportunity's kind of dwindled, but it, for a little while, was important. So that's where the universe of how we build. So if there's an opportunity of in the intersection of the real estate opportunity and the community need, so we're not going to build in, if there's that intersection, then we move into what's called the feasibility stage. So we really look at, okay, well, here's this parcel, what could we fit there? How high? What would the setback be? What's the zoning? What are the physical parameters? What could we build? Sometimes things like parking ratio completely drives the project. If the parking ratio is high and we know we don't have political support to get a variance, the whole feasibility of the project is gone in one fell swoop. So what's the physical constraint of the site? We need to look at the environmental constraints. Is it a contaminated site? Could there be underground tanks? What was the former use of this site? We look at the title. We have a title report done, and it says, oh, who owned it? What's on the title? What kind of easements are there? What bizarre things do we need to know now before we move ahead? Or costly things do we need to know? We look at the financial feasibility, and that's a really big piece. And I think the critical thing is how could we put together various financing sources necessary, not just to build it, but so that we can operate it at the lowest possible rents to the tenants. So our mission is completely different than a for-profit developer. A for-profit developer looks at a site and says, how much money can we make by building housing here? We look at a site and say, how low income can we serve? So when we put our financing together, it's a little bit like buying a house in a way. What's your income, what's your expenses, and what could you afford to pay for debt, right? So you do your own calculation, you say, okay, I can afford a $500,000 house. We look at that too. What are all the different subsidies we put on? What are our expenses? And what do we have left over to borrow? Because it's very rare that we can find enough public subsidy to put together a project with no conventional debt at all. And then when you think about the operations, what rent do we charge? What do we pay for the lights and the utilities and all that? And what's left over to pay the debt? So our entire goal is to structure a project to serve the lowest income. And sometimes it's not possible. If a site is too expensive, and we look at all this, myriad of funding sources from, local funds. So Tom did a really great job explaining sort of what those sources are. So historically, there was redevelopment money. There's some federal money through HOME or CDBG. Some locations have parcel tax money or inclusionary fee or in lieu fee. So what local money is there? What state money is there? And what federal money is there? And then what's the gap? What do we have to finance using, market rate or slightly below market rate funds from banks? So if we say, okay, well, we think this project is feasible. If we could do, 75 2- and 3-bedroom apartments, we would serve families earning less than a third of the area median income. we could possibly get this money from the local government, this money from the state, this federal money through this tax credit program that was mentioned. We could support a little bit of debt. Okay, I think we could do it. We also have to have political support. So none of the local money or local momentum around zoning or planning approvals can happen without local political support. And sometimes that comes easily. You have a friendly city to affordable housing that's made the effort to identify sites or to stash aside some money. So maybe the local government is favorable, but the neighborhood is absolutely dead set on stopping this project. And 5 different nonprofit groups have tried to get a project through, and the local neighbors have just locked it down. Or sometimes you have the other way. You have a community that would probably accept affordable housing, but you have a particular city council person that says no more, or they say no family, just senior. And that happens a lot. So it is much more politically feasible for us to develop senior housing. And I think that is a good example in San Leandro, where there was a project that was stalled. And when the developer said, okay, we'll do senior, all the political ducks fall in a row. So sometimes, we did a transition age youth project in Berkeley for 16 homeless youth. And we had, Berkeley is not an easy place to develop. We've had a lot of trouble building in Berkeley, but for some reason, that project, everybody wanted. We were able to get support from the neighbors, we were able to get support from the city staff, from the council, and we built it. And it's interesting because a lot of it really is about how you operate the project once you're built, and that's what kind of develops your reputation. So, looking at feasibility, you look at the financial feasibility, the political feasibility, and then the site constraints. And then a project, if all of those things fall in a row, which happens maybe one of every 20 projects you look at, one is feasible, then you begin the long and arduous process of actually developing it. And honestly, that can take 6 years, that can take 8 years, that can take 10 years between the first glimmer in your eye of, oh, that site looks like it could be good affordable housing, and the time the first family gets the keys and moves in. It can be a decade. Because the steps involved after this feasibility are then you go out and on a parallel track, you assemble all of this competitive financing at the same time as working through the city planning approval and zoning approval and whatever their local design review process is. And both of these can take a really long time, and there's kind of a give and take between the two that you're always kind of negotiating between. Finally, you've secured the financing, you've secured the entitlements and the building permit. You have a moment in time where everything comes together and the construction starts. And then the construction can take a year to 2 years generally for new construction, or maybe 6, 8, 10 months for a rehabilitation. And during that time, the architect is involved, the contractor is involved, the lawyers are involved, the insurance is involved. It's business, it's real estate, and there's risks, and it's not for the faint of heart. You're working away, and suddenly there's a torrential rain and an underground creek that no one knew about, comes to the fore. And
or Jerry Brown takes away redevelopment.
Jerry Brown takes around redevelopment.
Right like that.
The unions decide, I've had this happen. We do almost all union work, but sometimes the unions fight with each other, and so they, stop the job or a lawsuit. Anyway, there's just a lot of heartburn in the development process. But then comes the day when the development's almost finished. I get a lot of questions about who do you rent to, how do you do it? We do a lottery process, so we have a period of time where applications are available, people apply, people get on a list, we do credit checks, landlord checks, very importantly, income certification, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but is actually really important. We get a lot of very restricted money, and we have to be absolutely sure that everybody moving into this building is there because they're low income and they went through a fair lottery process, and not because they're our friends or because we like them or anything like that. So that's an intensive process. And then finally, people move in. And so that's the success, and that's what's worth the blood, sweat, and tears over, a decade or more to build, 50, 60, 70 homes, is the people who move in and their lives are changed, and so that's what makes it all worth it. But that's a little bit of a kind of 10-minute summary of how it all happens. And I'm totally happy to answer any questions you
That
have.
was great, thank
Oh.
you. We don't even know each other, and I mean, that exactly matches, like, probably Michael will say, like, his.
I'm done.
Now you know why he's got, never mind. All the white hair, I watched it happening through those stories. But just to summarize, what I think is really important to sort of connect to Albany is, just briefly, is some of the highlights of what Susan was saying is all the ways they find sites. There's no magic bullet. It's really hard, and it really is both a community service, if you will, and a real estate deal. And I think a lot of times communities, at least I work with, even the ones that really want housing, and she's talking about ones that sometimes don't, and it can be really rough. I think Albany, this is a testament to a community that's really very interested now and trying to look at this further. But sometimes, you just can't even make you can't get out of the gate with sort of political process. And the money, I can't stress enough, and I think Michael will talk more, you can have the greatest idea, the greatest community, strongest need, and we did a study once for the state of California, and this was years ago, where the average affordable housing project in California had 7 funding sources, and that was when there was more money in some ways, and it's probably a bigger average number now. And each of these is its own process. Also timing, I was hoping you'd mention that. I've seen many projects fall apart because if you get one funding source lined up, but then you miss a deadline or it's got a different calendar, it just can be a nightmare. Anyway, that was great.
That's what happened to TOD, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's a long story there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was on the bad end of one of those too.
Yeah. Okay, so I think Michael's going to tell you a little more about Albany, and we're a little over, but hopefully this is interesting and helpful, and we can then get to Q&A.
I'll try to keep this relatively brief. As Janet said, I actually have worked off and on at a place called the John Stewart Company since 1984. And they both manage and develop property. The hat I actually have on today is since about 2000, I've taught at the University of California, Berkeley. There's a capstone housing course where I try to match up, we match up groups of students with developers that are interested in having what we call a free look. Free look means that I co-teach it with an architect. We actually design a project, try to do the financial feasibility, and kind of give the nonprofit some notion over what's going on. And this is actually even more interesting because initially Susan didn't know, but we've been working with her director of development at looking at one site in Albany. And so what it really boiled down to is for Saha, it's a little early in the process for them to spend money to try to see whether or not a site makes sense. So what we try to do is step into nonprofits and say, you don't need to spend money yet. What we can do is identify some of the issues. We can look at what funding sources there are currently, what issues there are, and then give that back to them so that they can consume that without having to spend a bunch of money doing it. So in essence, we kind of act as public consultants in that process, and then I get to train students at the same time. So in Albany has this interesting thing. There are very few limited vacant sites. There is some possibility for redevelopment. The sites tend to be relatively small. Susan and I were talking before. We started I generally charge students with saying you're going to do a project that's at least 40 units. Because one of the problems you run into is that you need to have, as Susan said, you've got to qualify everybody. You need to have a manager basically on a full-time basis to qualify them. So you have to divide their cost up by units. And so if you had 20 units, you're paying twice as much for your manager. Similarly, something as simple as John Stewart managed about 40,000 units, including small and large. I actually did an analysis. And just the accounting piece, you write twice as many checks per unit for a project that's small than you do for a large one. So you have to pay the same utility bill, right? So if you've got 100 people, it's one bill. If you've got, it's 1/100th of the activity than if you've got a 20-unit project. So those add up really quickly. So the reality is there's a lot of reasons to try to push certainly up towards at least 40. I actually say try to get to about 50 units. I think Susan would agree, 50. But as she said, on the other side, if there's a will in a jurisdiction, it may make sense to do smaller projects. And that's not, just kind of a straight, you do it or you don't do it. But the flip side is that the fewer units, the more your operating costs are, the less debt you can carry, the more cash you're going to need to build the project. So we really try to look at both the financial feasibility as well as preliminary design. So my students are 3.5 weeks in. They met with the city, kind of going through some of the zoning issues. Last week, they're now designing units to make sure that the units they thought they could get in actually can have people that could live in them. So we actually try to design the interior spaces as well. And they've done a first round of what the financial feasibility is, and they're actually starting in now to do the kind of more detailed analysis. And probably in about 3 weeks, they're going to be done. That actually goes back to SAHA. So that we'll write a report to SAHA, and if SAHA's all right with it, we can give it to the City of Albany as well for whatever kind of thoughts we come away with. The one issue I know we're going to run into, and I think Susan alluded to it, is at this particular point in time, funding sources are really at a dearth. State's basically just about out of money at all levels. Redevelopment's not around anymore. MHSA's, the mental health funds are backing off. So the availability of sources of funding are probably close to an all-time low, at least in the last decade. So I'm sure we're going to come back with there's going to be a difficulty based on that. We're going to go to the next one. So
Did you want to just, sorry to interject, but could you go back just for a moment? What I think Michael was heading towards also was trying to talk a little bit about challenges, particularly in Albany, the way we're built. And, one that you have been working with too is proximity. So we're sort of built, we have small lots, and we're looking at infill, and it's really hard to get to that scale of units that Michael was mentioning. And the other thing is proximity to single-family neighborhoods. So a lot of you have sort of lived through some of that, I think, with some projects that we've tried to anticipate. I'm sorry, I just wanted to connect it to Albany a little bit. So you might want to go on now.
Okay.
Next slide.
All right, so the reality, the site we're looking at actually is illustrative. It is, you could pick it up and walk it down the street. So it's the Mechanics Bank site that's at the corner of Washington, but if you picked it up and went down by the Sizzler, there's a similar site there. There is a Hertz site up. So you need to look at this not just as, this is how I developed Mechanics Bank, but it's really trying to analyze some of the issues behind doing affordable housing. It happens to be that the site that had been shopped around was the Mechanics Bank site as a quote-unquote potential site, but we've also looked at the Vista Grade School, elementary school at one point in a prior year. And so you really should look at it as that this is basically prototypical of the issues that you're going to face in Albany. As I said, our goal is to maximize the number of units. The problem that we run into on a lot of the sites, Mechanics Bank site is 22,500 square feet. To get to 40 to 50 units, you need to really be, in general, closer to 3/4 of an acre to an acre. So the number of sites that are available are relatively slim. And again, part of the reason you're doing that is to maximize the efficiency of the building, and that's in both directions. It's getting large enough so that you get kind of mainline contractors who are willing to bid on it. So you have enough volume in your contract so that you get people on the development, on the construction side who want to bid. I actually have had projects that have been so small that it's hard to find people willing to bid. So we tend to want to go up to 40 to 50, partly for the reason of getting efficiencies in terms of the construction cost, as well as on the management side. Whatever I do, if I've got to spread it over 20 units versus 50 units, in essence, I'm going to have higher operating expenses. And as Susan mentioned, we're going to have some private debt in virtually every one of these processes, and it just lowers the amount of debt that I can get. I would say one thing that hasn't really been mentioned yet, but I always kind of harp on is, one of the things we're doing is we're actually pre-purchasing at least 30 years worth of housing services. So when you think about building an affordable project, You're actually building it so that you can have it occupied over the next 30 years. So the fact that you have debt, if you were trying to get something that you weren't going to use for 30 years, you might have debt yourself. So it's not that unusual. The other thing we've got to do is meet some pretty complex funding requirements. So I can, reality, I know they're going to look at using the low-income housing tax credit. There are set-asides. One of the set-asides, which is probably the only one outside of seniors you guys could go for unless it was a special needs project, is to do large families. So you could basically say, I'm going to do a large family project. You get points for that, and if you don't get those points, you don't get funded. So it's a very, very competitive environment, and so unless you go in and say, I'm going to be one of these projects, you're not going to get funded. And in the state of California, a large family project is a project that has 3 or more, 30% of the units have 3 or more bedrooms. So it's for large. So the biggest shortfall in the state of California is actually, among other things, is for large families. So it's been a priority in the state of California for at least 20 years, and they're still way behind. The other thing that you're going to need to have, and this is going to be where we're going to have difficulty, is those programs require that you demonstrate a local commitment. And that demonstration is in the form of money.
Or land.
Well,
Put land.
money converted into land. You take your choice. That the community will need to bring some value because there's such a demand for housing that, in essence, everybody's in line saying, I want to build this. And so the regulations have basically kind of amped up what they think cities need to provide in that process. So when you heard San Leandro, they had a TOD grant that on one, they use redevelopment on another. They've got their own source funds, and so the reality is that they actually explicitly, the final criteria for whether or not you can get funded versus anybody else is how much the city has invested in the project. So that's going to become key. So if you look at, very quickly, I'm going to do a real shortcut, as I said, 2 to 3 weeks. I didn't want to, I have students, I'm a slave master, so I didn't want them to show up because they actually have a presentation in about 2.5 weeks to the client. They don't present to me, they actually present to the director of development. Yes, I'm sorry. I don't like microphones. So Mechanics Bankside is actually, as I said, it's about 22,500 square feet. It's actually split in terms of zoning, the front 100 feet of that. So back to about where, just past the drive-through is called SPC, which is San Pablo Commercial.
Thank you.
The FAR on that with the floor area ratio is how many square feet of building and structured parking you have in relation to how big the lot is. So it's a 22,000 square foot lot overall. The front half of the lot's 10,000 square feet. So under normal zoning, you could build 22,500 square feet of building. R3 is on the back half. So we're actually in 2 different zones at the same time. So the back half, which is basically where the parking lot is in the R3 zone. That allows you to build 1.5 times the floor area, so that this is a 12,000 square foot parcel. So you can build about 18,000 on it. It also has the San Pablo side has a 38-foot height limit, 38-foot height limit. If you did all residential and you really pushed on the floors, you might be able to get 4 floors. But if you do commercial, which the assumption on this is that Mechanics Bank, if they were going to go here, if the site were going to go forward, Mechanics Bank would probably want to go back in as a lease in the same space. They've got extra space at this point. So at that point, you need to be 15 to 18 foot on the first floor, so you can only get 3 floors no matter what. So basically, the zoning on the front half says you can have 3 stories of things.
Building.
The back half says you can have, in essence, 1.5 covering the entire building. 2012, the state of California passed an ordinance that if you provide affordable housing at a certain level, and we're looking at doing 100%, so we're over that, you are entitled to get 35% more square footage above what's permitted by zoning. Now, for both of those in the city of Albany, currently there are 2 spaces per unit, less for affordable, and I turn to Jeff and say, we don't know how much less. There is an ordinance that fixes it to 2. There is some maneuvering room based on affordable. If somebody's interested, I'll let Jeff go into it. But that ends up being our second major constraint, is that you've got to provide parking. Unless anybody doesn't realize, if I have a 2-bedroom unit or a 1-bedroom unit, a 1-bedroom unit's about 650 square feet. If I had to provide 2 parking spaces for that 1-bedroom unit, I need to provide 700 square feet of parking for a 650 square foot unit.
More for the car than the household.
On a 1-bedroom.
We took that off the slide, but we figured this out last night.
So one of the issues that will continue to emerge, and I think Susan talked about it as well, that parking ends up being a really large bugaboo. And I do know that the students have been playing around with, can I do stackers? Is there some way that I can get the amount of parking I want in on that site to meet enough of the code that I've got a development that can go forward? Because the only other option is to go below ground, and you add about 25,000 to 30,000 of space to do that. So it's almost immediately an infeasible project if you have to dig below ground in order to put the parking on it. And if you guys are from Albany, if you go along Albany, nobody's below ground.
Some are partial.
There's some partials. There's some step down. You're right. The current zoning, however, requires, they're actually non-conforming, aren't they? Yeah, they're non-conforming. So that if you wanted to go back and rebuild that, you would not be able to build it that way. So there is a step back, which I think in some senses is good, because if you're going to be directly adjacent to a residential neighborhood, it really does make sense to kind of soften what your view is. And in point of fact, if whatever these students do, it's going to be a lot less intrusive than the 3-story that's next to them. But the real question is there enough space to be able to accomplish what you need to accomplish? So from a design perspective, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but what it does mean is that each one of these things cuts into how much square footage you can build on that site. Remember, I'm limited to 3 stories no matter what, and if I have to keep stepping back, that's another section that I don't have to do. And unlike Susan, I'm the reverse. I basically say you're going to do as many units as you can do, and you're going to do as little parking as you can do, because I'm trying to train developers. And ultimately, it's a negotiation, but you need to know kind of how far you can push in one direction to figure out whether or not you've got a project that works. So in reality, you need to at least start out thinking, can I get enough parking to satisfy everybody? And can I have a building envelope that gives me enough units to have a project that's feasible? So as I said, they're most of the way through that.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Last slide.
So preliminary design shows the whole site probably can't be used for housing units, although Susan and I were talking about that a bit. They're right now trying to shoehorn about 40 units onto that site. There would be 3 bedrooms, 1 bedrooms, and studios. Studios for potentially the ex-bald people or some of the homeless that were in the area as a permanent transition location. But it would be permanent housing, not transition. And then 3 bedrooms because you have to do 3 bedrooms, and 1 because if you do 1 bedroom or studios, the state density law also allows you to cut back to 1 bedroom or 1 parking space per unit no matter what. So in essence, they're trying to get 40 units and trying to find parking to get to probably about a 1.2 parking ratio as opposed to 2 parking spaces per car. And I'm not sure, the last time we talked, they were getting relatively close to it, but as I said, we went through it with the city and kind of rejiggered, and they're actually designing units this week. Next week, they'll go back and try to finalize the sizing. I'm trying to hold to 40. It may be possible to get a developer who's willing to do it with less units, but it's going to take more local support in order to make that happen. And again, the other reason being that you get down much below 40 units and there's a limited developer fee when you're a nonprofit and you develop, you have to take on all the risk. And if the project runs into a problem, it comes out of your pocket. So in essence, the developer is paid partially to compensate themselves for the risk and for future operating projects. And at a certain point, it just gets so low that it just doesn't make economic sense to assign staff for up to 9 years to work on a project just to have, get a small enough amount that it doesn't make financial sense. The last time we went through and looked at it, it looked like they were pushing on the FAR. Albany actually doesn't have an unreasonably low FAR. The floor area ratio that's in place on San Pablo, it's 2.25. On Solano, it's 1.5. So at this particular, on Solano itself. So at this particular time, the only place that has anywhere near enough density to do affordable on really is along San Pablo. Outside of that, you just can't get enough square foot to make a large enough development make sense. And in a smaller development, you start running into operating costs being too high, so it doesn't work. So for a variety of reasons, I'm trying to push them to 40. They're pretty close to it. They would be studios 1s and 3s. The thing that would make it work would be they're actually buying technology because you have to pay for parking spaces, but if you do a stacker, those are stacker units.
Which is what that photo
If you go up on right outside of downtown Berkeley and look, all the developments along, is it Henry, I think it is? It turns into Solano. The thing that turns into Solano, the entire length of that, once you get past the university, basically has a whole series of developments, Shattuck, that use this approach. So it's been used a fair amount. So they're looking at doing that. So we're buying, but what it really means is that we're going to have to spend money buying technology in order to get around the zoning or the parking requirement, even to get to the point where we're slightly below where the parking requirement would require us to be.
Okay, that was great, thank you. We went way over, but I hope that some of that was of interest. I'm just going to summarize very briefly where I was hoping we would get in this conversation. I think you heard was really that Albany's small sites and all these complexities mean that it's really hard in Albany. I mean, we're all lucky to have developers like Susan's organization who will look at some smaller units. It's blood, sweat, and tears. It takes a really long time. Costs a lot of money, and Michael was outlining some of it in this particular case where some of our best density is on the frontage of San Pablo for a variety of reasons that are historic that weren't talked about. The back sides of both sides of San Pablo are actually lower density and almost too low to make those pieces of properties work as part of these projects. Forcing parking underground, which makes it too expensive, which means Albany doesn't have any affordable housing. So these are all issues that we're happy as a panel to talk about more. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Barry. Thank you.
Before I turn the mic over to Barry, two quick things. First of all, Barry is working on our general plan, and I put in the back of the table, on the table in the back of the room, some flyers about the general plan generally. There's a link to a webpage, albany2035.org. So you might be interested in that. And there's also the Diverse Housing Working Group, I think, has a flyer back there for some events that they're doing that are related.
Thanks, Jeff. First, let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Great job. I want to emphasize everyone's volunteering tonight, so we're all here because we care about the subject, and it's really important to have this conversation. We have about half an hour now for questions to our panelists, and I'm just going to walk around with the microphone. If you raise your hand, I'll come over, and you can ask any of our four panelists or Jeff and I a question about what you've heard this evening. Responses, comments. If you don't have a question, if you have some feedback or thoughts on what's been said tonight. Yes, Bob, I'll come right over.
Could you just explain a little more about how structurally low-income housing tax credits get allocated? I mean, what agency does it? how does that work into financing and so forth?
Yeah. So California state tax credits are actually part of a federal program. It's actually administered by the IRS in the end. But it's passed down at the state level to a group called the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. Who are they through? Bill Lockyer.
It's not important.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
Sorry.
And in essence, on twice a year, they basically do an open competition. And there is a point system, and I believe it's 150 points at this point in time, including local effort, what kind of services you have, what kind of green building you're doing. So they basically have taken kind of California goals for what they want in housing and translated those into a point system. And so in February, and I think they just did September, twice a year they basically do an open competition in the state, and everyone in the state competes with each other. Now, there is a geographic set-aside, so the East Bay, I think it's Alameda and Contra Costa are in the same area, so...
And north.
Oh, and north. Okay, that's right, they switched
been a while.
it. So in essence, you're only competing at one level against projects that are in your immediate area, but you're competing against Oakland and El Cerrito and San Leandro. All those jurisdictions basically put up projects through the nonprofit community, and so the ones that meet the state's objectives the greatest get funded. And the reason I want that is because you basically get about somewhere 50 cents on the cost, 50 to 55 cents on a dollar of the cost. You get tax credits that you can sell to any number of organizations, including banks and some philanthropic organizations. And then in return, they give you roughly between 50 and 60 cents on a dollar. So now I only have to find 40 cents on a dollar to build the project. Is that enough? Okay.
It's the equity. So really, the tax credits become equity to the project, just like if you were buying a house, what your equity is. But there's, it's not the developer's money. It's the sale of the tax credit, which has value to the buyer. It gives you cash.
But they're limited partners, and so they have some say in how the project operates, but it's generally, the standard model, at least in Northern California, is that the managing general partner, you form a partnership, and the managing general partner is a nonprofit, and they bring in a for-profit who has a limited partner. And they only have limited ability to affect the day-to-day operations of the project. The other thing in the state of California is that if it is if the managing general partner is a nonprofit, you also don't pay property tax. So there is an additional wedge in there that as long as you're serving 80% or less and the managing general partner is a nonprofit, they waive the 1% portion. You still have to pay the amount above the pre-indebtedness above that. But on a project where the unit is costs $400,000 to build, which is kind of my rough guess of what they're going to cost, that means you don't have to pay $4,000 in property tax. Otherwise, the operating cost would get so high you wouldn't be able to build it.
Okay, question.
Yeah, so you've talked about a variety of obstacles that we face in Albany, but what you haven't really talked about are obstacles related to environmental impact. One of the realities, of course, with San Pablo is that planners have been very interested in transit-oriented districts, but that assumes you have transit that actually works for people and that will fit into their lifestyle, and in many ways we don't. The notion that we can reduce parking because people won't have cars, I've seen in a variety of instances that turns out not to be the case. People may use public transit, but that doesn't mean they don't own cars that get parked in the neighborhood. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. San Pablo, other communities have plans for San Pablo. El Cerrito is doing some planning at this point. How do we fit into that? And how do we deal with what is actually a public highway, which now has a rush hour in the morning and the evening, and we're going to add more traffic to that. So what are your thoughts about that?
So Barry, if it's all right, I'd like to address that.
Sure.
I was on the parking task force, and I work on this professionally in all those other cities. just appointed here, so I can't. So you brought up a couple of really important topics, I think. The first one is an important one, that in theory, San Pablo Avenue is supposed to have good bus service. And unfortunately, it's an example of where the policies that come from one set of agencies don't always match the reality on the ground. I mean, you can look at this any way you want to, but that is the theory, that it is a transit corridor. It's served by bus. There are also parts of Albany, including our house on Spokane Avenue, which is considered within a half mile of that BART station at El Cerrito. We're in a TOD zone. So there are pieces of Albany that also fit in a mass transit, BART TOD zone. If there were properties in that part of Albany or next door in El Cerrito, that's some of the same money available at different points in time that Tom was describing that were made available to a TOD project there. I think the other thing to talk about, I'm hoping we don't bog down on parking with the limited time we have left, but I'll just mention, in case you don't know, that 2 spaces per unit is extraordinarily high. I can't say it's the only city in the Bay Area left with 2 spaces per unit, because I don't know. I've never encountered one in my professional practice that high as a uniform parking requirement. But the city, and then there's been a task force, and there's a lot of work on this. So while there might be concern about that ratio, and there might be feelings and opinions that folks need 2 spaces per unit, the reality is, especially in affordable housing, the lower your income in general, the fewer cars you do own. And so if you start to put these pieces together, that's at least the theory of why San Pablo has, for a while now, through this old planning process called the San Pablo Avenue Vision Plan, been zoned at 63 units an acre. That's pretty good density. That's probably more than most, but not all of San Leandro. They upzoned around their transit, their BART, higher than that, but I bet some of your other arterials aren't that high. So we have a lot of the pieces in place, but I think you're asking really, really good questions. And sometimes these are really hard to resolve. It's an example, I think, of how affordable housing can bump into other issues, but there are examples out there where it's been solved.
Tom, were you wanting to
Just
add?
wanted to add another way, and that helps developers, nonprofit and for-profit. We take our downtown TOD, which Jen mentioned and worked on. We did a full-blown environmental impact report for that plan. So the downtown project that I showed you, as well as the tech campus, they benefited from that in terms of the developers saving money, having to spend a year plus spending hundreds of thousands, well, several hundred thousands of dollars doing a full-on environmental. And we took that out of the equation for them because they fit right under our plan, which included reduced parking, particularly for the housing.
Well, I'd actually go one step further, and that's that if you went and looked at actual affordable developments and found out what their required parking ratios that they actually utilize are, I know I've dealt with the Balsi a bunch. I'm sure you guys have run through this. They know how many spaces are actually being occupied on an ongoing basis because the spaces are assigned. And in point of fact, it certainly isn't 2. And in point of fact, I think they tend to run about 1.1. I actually have to go do research.
And it probably depends
But
where it is.
on the reverse side, I was over in San Francisco we did what's it called? Bay.
It's been too long.
Yeah, it's been too long. We did a project over there that's got Trader Joe on the ground floor of North Point. Their parking ratio, they actually required one. We actually took parking out of the apartments and leased it because the amount of parking that was required by the residents was only about 0.75. So it really does depend on what the kind of the group looks like. And I'd certainly, if I were doing this as a developer, I wouldn't come back and say, just waive my parking. I would say, here are these 9 developments that are in kind of a similar category to where you are, to where we're located. I can show you how much parking there actually is in those.
That's needed.
That's needed. I think you've got to watch how much you do at the same time.
And I can add something as well as I'm walking over, which is as part of the general plan update, we're doing an environmental impact report that's testing the impacts of adding about 700 housing units to the city of Albany, most of which would be on San Pablo, to see what would be the effect of that on traffic volumes and on congestion at the intersections, and then decide if mitigation measures are needed to improve traffic flow. So we're looking at the effects of adding density. Let me go to this gentleman.
Thank you. I noticed on the slides that most of the projects seem to be multifamily housing. And I wonder why we're not seeing 1 and 2 family housing, which usually is a lot less expensive to build. I'm pretty new to this area, but where we moved from, there was a general practice of single and 2 family houses on lots as small as 8 feet wide. I'm talking about South Philadelphia. And, you know, it was very efficient, and you can really build a lot for a lot less money than multifamily housing. And I just wonder why that form doesn't exist here.
So I own a consulting firm with offices all over the country, so I have to look at these differences too. And there's a whole bunch of answers, and I think it would take longer than we have left tonight. But I think here's a couple of things to consider. The way California land use policy works is that in general, we've tried to really increase zoning. Tom was talking about this, to take advantage of transit. In South Philly, you already have the transit and you have a lot of density. Each lot is small, but you have a lot of people living in 1 square mile. A lot of California is auto-oriented, less dense. The irony or uniqueness of Albany is that it's extremely dense in converse to all of that. So we have a really nice land use pattern. Someday I'm going to write a book about this, but we have 18,000 people in 1 square mile. That's second only to New York City. Wow. Midtown, and I've done that analysis. So it's very dense here, and we have a really nice mix. We don't feel like that. We have a lot of single families. But to get to your question, the reason why you hear us all talking about multifamily is expense. The biggest difference is where you come from. I think you've probably seen this. It's a lot more expensive here. Land alone is so expensive that it's equal to the entire cost of some of the units you're talking about, depending on where you're talking about. Where you in Philly. So, you know, our land cost per unit, if you were doing single family, would be on the order of $250,000 alone for the land on a small lot like what you're talking about. That's why we all want to cram as many units on that same parcel that we have to pay for as we can. So I hope that helps sort of start the answer.
It's also ownership versus rental, because again, if I only have 2 units, the operating costs for those 2 units are going to run up, right? Because I still have to provide some level of that experience. And we actually, at John Stewart, they actually managed a series of scattered sites in Los Angeles that were 5-unit buildings, and they were just impossible to manage.
Absolutely.
I said I'm separating ownership from rental.
Yeah, absolutely.
On an ownership, I don't think any of us have talked about the kind of the ownership side of that tonight. But certainly, if you wanted to do ownership, doing some smaller projects that were ownership projects, I don't think is out of the range of possibility,
Well,
with the exception of
and
land.
I wanted to add, I mean, this is beyond the call, but the site we were showing, if you can't get to 40 units and get your tax credits, another option, because I'm thinking about this financially, is, you know, on the Kane side, you might start to think more about some townhouse, row house concept that does fit within the zoning. You could think market rate. There are projects that mix market rate and affordable in very many ways. There are projects that mix rental and ownership. All of these add complexities, and Susan's probably groaning inside. But, you know, that's another way to get creative about trying to fund some pieces and also fit. So I think you're asking a really good question, and it relates somewhat to that.
Okay, I saw 4 hands go up, and I'm going to start here and work my way around that way towards Lonnie, so go ahead.
Sorry, I have 2 questions, but I think the first one will be quick. I was just wondering, for maybe Susan mostly, but what's the average stay of families or singles in an affordable housing?
You know, that's a great question, and it's something that I would love to really analyze across our portfolio. So I can't say statistically, but I would say anecdotally, it's 5 years or more. I mean, at least. I think especially in our senior buildings now, our senior buildings have different age requirements, so we have some where you can be as young as 55 and move in, and some you have to be 62, depending on the funding sources. But we find that, especially in senior buildings, when people move in, they stay as long as they can live independently, that having that stability is really critical. So we had a resident who just celebrated her 105th birthday, one of our properties, and she's been living there, 20 years or more. I'd say with the families, it's also pretty stable. Really, a lot of it is because the market, there's just nothing else. And so our dream sometimes is that families move on to home ownership. And there was a tiny window when sales prices were depressed enough that we actually had some families leave who had saved enough, living in affordable housing, could actually buy an inexpensive house. But I'm sad to say I think that time is gone. We do have the housing that is for the transition age youth, the stay is much shorter. Many of those young people, the units are generally smaller, and many of them choose to move on to other housing situations in a 2 to 3 year period once they've stabilized. But I would say overall the tenure is really long.
And then as you mentioned, the seniors, I just had a question. If all of you guys were thinking about just the increase of seniors that are coming, and since it seems easier to get senior housing approved, if you've thought of that kind of baby boomer generation that's on its way at all.
Yeah, I would say our experience is that a growing percentage of our projects in our pipeline, those are the projects that aren't built yet, are senior, and it's a combination of there's a huge need, there's political support, and sometimes the funding is favorable and sometimes it isn't. It's very subtle and it really depends. There's a whole complicated formula. There's this set aside, and some set asides are oversubscribed or undersubscribed.
We're trying not to boggle your mind so late at night.
It's not always easier to do senior, I guess is what I'm saying. Sometimes the funding is even scarcer. Because the days where there was this very robust program from HUD, from the federal government, called the 202 program, that was just a guaranteed pipeline program. There was funding every year. Projects still competed, but it was always there. It's been completely eliminated. So there's really no dedicated source for senior housing anymore.
Yeah, I'd say it's sort of community by community based on your need. But one thing to keep in mind, if you're a smaller community, I think that we always say too that when you build an affordable project that's sort of open to all, that's inclusive of seniors and people with special needs.
Right.
So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is when we had redevelopment was also cautious with, and they had in their regulations a limit on the amount of senior housing you could build, because for some communities that was all they would prefer to build, and they didn't want to build any of the other needed housing that special needs or a larger family or extremely low income. And so in redevelopment regulations, they'd actually put sort of a limitation so cities wouldn't get sort of carried away on just one type of housing.
And I'm going to add something that's probably my bias. He just said it very politically correct. I'll say it the other way. Cities cop out and build affordable housing only senior. No. This is Albany. The people that are elderly here, the need is not, they own houses. These houses have, increased the longer you're here for incredible amounts of money. There are ways that elderly in Albany, generally speaking, probably can find housing of some kind because they already own the house. So if it's our community, what we want to think about, I think, are the people who work here, who we'd love to stop commuting and creating traffic. That's one way to think about it. So those are lower wage, younger workers. It might be our children who can't even afford to live here or rent here at all. It might be, it's anyone from our community who has a need, who is not someone who's owned a house for 40 years, experiencing all that appreciation. And we're all kind of trained to think of that, I'm going to say it, almost like a cop-out. Like that's the cop-out a lot of times, to not confront the harder decisions to house other components of the community.
Well, I also think there's another thing, and that's if Albany has an asset that would be enjoyed in the Bay Area, it has really good schools. And then in point of fact, I actually worked on a couple developments 2 years ago for nonprofits that were doing Walnut Creek projects because they wanted the Walnut Creek school system. So we do have an asset that is good for large families, to help large families get established and get back in mainstream. If they're not in the mainstream. If they're in the mainstream, as you said, it's partly just an income problem on top of it. In point of fact, we've got really good schools that we can offer.
Okay, let's go back to another question. Sorry to cut you off.
We
We've
could
got
talk all night.
a lot of hands coming up. Go ahead.
First, one quick comment about the seniors. There are plenty of seniors that are renters that are low income and can use subsidized housing. First, I'd like to thank you for this great example using Mechanics Bank because it just whetted my appetite and creativity, and I have to say, wow, this is a possibility. But to make that happen, I'd like to find out whether we have this design finished. Can we have a cost to build it? And in your
To this point, we have not done a land cost, just because we're trying to, they're students. There's only so much they can get to. We do have, I think what it'll end up being is it's construction cost. So they will take an estimate of construction costs. I think it's about $400,000 a unit, at least the last version I saw, as well as $400,000 per unit. It may be a little less because there's a lot of studios and ones, as well as what sources there are and what the shortfall is. And to that would be added the land, only because I don't want to get them involved in trying to do an estimate of land costs. They don't have the capability of pulling it off in a 7.5-week period.
Well, I don't expect them to, but I would think that as you present it, that we put that factor into it and have some professional do it, because that will let us know what it would cost. And then, so the question would be, then what would the city have to put up? So 40 units at $400,000 a unit at a land cost of what, $100,000 a unit? That's
My guess is,
You're a little high,
times
probably.
40.
my guess is it's probably going to need about $3 million. My guess is it's probably going to need about $3 million.
Okay.
But it's up, like I said, they're in the
Right.
early part of going through that.
$3 million, that would include acquisition costs.
And probably you have to add acquisition costs on top of that.
Okay.
Sorry.
And then the one last question is just, I know that at least one of the new city councilors is really interested in changing the parking requirement. So my very simple question, what would require a vote with the city, a new measure, and a vote citywide? What would you recommend to be the new parking requirement?
So having served on the parking task force with others in the audience, I'm going to throw this to Jeff. There is a report, there's a staff report, and council's already taken this, and I'm protecting my husband. You have to understand, he's not been party to that. I think you heard this evening that the lower it is down to 0, the better for affordable housing. Most cities have 1 or 1.2 or 1.5. So Jeff, did you want to comment on that? Or not? You can say not.
Yeah. How are the A's doing? No, I don't have any sort of predetermined recommendation to the city council or the community about what the parking standards should be. I think it needs to be something that works to let the kinds of projects that we want to have in the community happen. And as a planner, what we would do is look at an application. And if we have a little flexibility, that's our preference, because we can look at exactly where it's going, exactly what kind of a project it is, whether it's families or seniors or what have you, and we can adjust it project by project. And as most of you know, we do that in this room, long late night hearings involving everybody in the neighborhood. So from my perspective, flexibility is what we need to find the balance on a project by project basis.
And a single number is difficult because for ownership, it may be different than for rental.
Okay, we have a question here.
Thank you very much for all your information. I have a couple questions or parts of questions. One is, or maybe this first one's a comment. I know we're using the word affordable, but I also know that the word affordable has a lot of meanings. So I just want to stress that I'm really interested in affordable housing for extremely low income, and I just want that to be put out there so that we don't end up with people with the medium income housing, but the truly housing for people who would like to live in Albany who can't, or who live on the streets because they want to live in Albany. And the other question I just have is about selecting sites. So there are other empty spots, so I know that there must be some ways that you're choosing these. Like the Mechanics Bank and the Sizzler were examples I know when you were in the housing element. I was curious then, does that mean it's for sale, that they've said they want to? So part of it is, how do you select a site if it's occupied? And the second one, I was just sort of general I know there are other empty places in Albany, and so are you using it that you want it to be near transportation, or that it needs to be on San Pablo, or what are the reasons that we're not looking at other places like empty lots that are maybe, I don't know what they are now, but anyway, there are other spots. I'm just wondering how you decide.
I think there were two questions there. One's Barry's, because it's about housing opportunity sites, and then maybe I'll take a crack at the other one.
Yeah, I can respond to the question on the housing
Yeah.
opportunity sites. There are a number of things we look at. The zoning is probably the most important, and whether the site is zoned to allow for higher densities. So the San Pablo and Solano Avenue sites rise to the top because those are the sites where you can build the greatest density. In terms of the sites on those two streets, it's looking at the floor area that's on the site relative to the land area of the site. If it's a one-story building with a big parking lot, we would consider it underutilized relative to another site where the entire site is covered with buildings. If the value of the improvements on the site is very low relative to the value of the land, that's an indicator that it might be ripe for reuse and that there might be an opportunity to rebuild. We did that analysis for all of San Pablo Avenue and Solano Avenue to come up with a list of about 17 sites. The other thing is we were really trying to look at sites that were 20,000 square feet or larger, because those tend to be the most conducive to development. The other question?
Well, I think it was sort of the perfect segue. So the studio that you heard being discussed was sort of an outgrowth of some of those same criteria that Barry was mentioning. But I think it's important to say, this is not driven by anything announced for sale. There's nothing known by any of us about what's for sale. And that's probably the hardest challenge is we can do a plan. Barry with the community can write a great plan. We can talk about what it takes. But, we are land constrained. It's just that what we're looking at is where the zoning is the highest, the sites are quite large relative for Albany, the transit is there, and because we're thinking multifamily, because that's kind of where the money is, that's how you end up at sites like what we're talking about.
And they do show up because they were, shown as housing opportunity sites, and so kind of the
Everyone's
nonprofit
interested.
world was brought in to look at them, and then they actually brought us in. So I'm the real estate side, which, as Susan said, basically, if you're the real estate side, it's where's an available site, and can I do what I need to do on that available site?
Be changed so that we could have it be there? Is that something that's...
The short answer is yes, and that's part of the general plan and other planning, and that's a perfect question. Hold that thought as you participate more in the general plan.
Thank you, Janet.
was a
There are a couple
commercial.
of questions over here and a couple over there, and then I think we're going to wrap it up. We've got maybe time for 4 more. Catherine?
Hi, thank you for coming out and explaining all of this. A lot of what you said went so quickly, I didn't completely get it, but I want to ask, can we be really bold and take on the challenge of reducing what we're doing so that it's the least resource heavy and the most economical? There are places which build very, very small apartments for people. And why not? We need to reduce our resource use in this country by 90%. It's time to start thinking smaller anyway. Wouldn't that help with the building of when you're trying to squeeze places and you could then make it cheaper? And then also the issue of food. If you're filling in all these spaces in Albany, we have to think about food security as well. So I want to put a plug in for rooftop gardens, please. Thank you.
I'm sorry to keep talking about this, but I've addressed all these issues for Albany and my clients in other cities. There are points in the tax credit world that you can get for energy efficiency, and they include solar and green roofs. And so the good news is California is a leading state on all of that. They've combined the goals of CO2 reduction with affordable housing funding, layered on top of that federal program. So it's pretty good. When I work in other states, which I'll go unnamed, there's no green in their same tax credit application. So there's a lot of progress being made. But I think you brought up I think what you were describing was the notion of size or unit size. And I think what you're hearing here is, there's a broad array of constraints and opportunities that all of us face to try to create affordable housing. They don't always line up with size. It's kind of the reality. So I think every developer is motivated to build the smallest possible unit for a given household size that they feel will be comfortable and give a good quality of life. It's very location dependent, occupant dependent. So if 30% of the units on that Mechanics Bank site need to be for three bedroom or more in order to get the tax credits, which is the single main force for funding permanent affordable housing left in California right now, you have to serve large families. Are they defined as 4 or more or 5 or more?
3-bedroom or more.
So you can make small 3-bedroom apartments, but I don't think they're going to be in the realm of 400 square feet to put a whole family in.
Actually,
and so,
you're constrained by the tax credit program for how small you can get,
Oh,
because
really? I didn't know that.
particularly for for-profit developers, if I could actually do a 100 square foot studio, I would do it. And so there are some minimum standard sizes as well that are built into those
So I
regulations.
think that's part of why that someone asked why multifamily. They're already smaller units. These are not large resource consuming units. When you build 63 units an acre on San Pablo, if you could tweak the zoning in the back, someone asked that question, so I'll just say it. You need to change the zoning in the back, but it's a controversial topic. So if you could get the whole thing to the front zone, you could fit 63 units on an acre. This is about half of an acre, right?
Yeah.
So you can fit 33 units. A third of them need to be 3 bedrooms or larger. The rest can all be studios. Susan has, or a developer like Susan, has to balance the revenue of all of that. But those are sort of the box of constraints. It would be a little weird to build all studios and a third large family, but it's not impossible. But you got to create a community too. So these are all these factors. It's a longer answer than you were probably thinking. But they're not large units. They're not luxury units or anything.
Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your energy. We've talked about transit-oriented districts, design, all of those, what Ds mean. Other than BART, what's the minimum transit that allows you to call yourself a TOD and allows you to get the benefits?
Jeff knows the answer because we looked at it in the task force, but it's generally 10-minute headways for buses, so we have it on San Pablo. Yes.
Yeah, we have it on San Pablo. It's actually 20 minutes, I think, is
Oh, sorry, I
is
thought
the
it was 10
is the
during peak or
criteria.
something.
There may be something like that.
Yeah.
So San Pablo Avenue and Solano Avenue, at least during rush hour, the 18 runs every 20 minutes. So the preliminary reading we've gotten is that we can call San Pablo and Solano transit. Yeah.
They may actually be close enough to BART.
Yeah, and then you can, from the northern few blocks of Albany, you can walk to El Cerrito Plaza. That's
So I was
within a half
mentioning,
mile.
yeah. We have a TOD zone over there.
Okay, Peter?
Thank you. I'll try to condense this as much as possible. I had 2 questions. One was about the tax credits. I'm curious as to how many applications there are for the number that actually get it. And are these tax credits, in your opinion, going to fill the gap of no redevelopment funds or those going away and the shrinking federal funding?
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think it's really interesting because in order to even be competitive for tax credits, you have to score perfect points. So you wouldn't even submit an application if you did not maximize points in every scoring criteria. And those scoring criteria include things like green building, proximity to transit, proximity to other services. So all the projects that submit have perfect scores. So it goes to this crazy tiebreaker. And within the tiebreaker, the main driver is around the percent of non-tax credit sources, other public sources that you're leveraging. So places like San Leandro that were really wise and cobbled together lots of local resources may have had a very high scoring project. So it's kind of hard to say how many potential projects are out there. The only ones that compete have perfect scores. So in this like North and East Bay in the last round, there were maybe 8 projects. All of them had perfect scores. It goes to this crazy tiebreaker that comes down to like percentage of percentages on which project is going to win. And then a project might get skipped because that set aside is already taken out. So, and the hard thing is you don't know who you're competing against until you submit.
So we did a study about 10 years ago for the state that I referenced before, 12 years ago. And at that point, there were 8 requests for every tax credit available, and that was long ago. It's worse now.
Yeah.
So they self-select now.
And that's why
you
she's
don't even
saying you don't
apply.
even bother, because it costs them legal money and other money to
Yeah.
submit your
If
application.
I could add real quickly too. So again, right, the tax credit doesn't substitute because for cities and counties, we are struggling to find that way to find the leveraged money we can put into a project. And that's the money that we lost with redevelopment. And
Yeah.
we're still, and HUD's been also, the federal government's been reducing our federal money as well over the years. The other thing is that tax credits can also be accessed by private developers. And we had a recent project where they didn't need any of our city assistance. One thing, and we like to work with nonprofits, especially with affordable housing. In a case like that, it's great that they're providing low-income housing, but we like also to have some skin in the game, and we'd like to, and we have a good partnership with nonprofits, and we'd like to have some sense of control. So that's why it's good for us to have those local funds available to put into a project.
Okay, and I had one other question that's more specific to Albany here. You mentioned this Mechanics Bank study, and I think Mechanics Bank would, in that scenario, would keep space along San Pablo for the bank, and then
Right.
housing would be on top and behind.
Right.
I know that El Cerrito is proposing some housing, and I believe one of their ideas is to put housing all the way down on the street on a commercial thing. I'm wondering, is that something that you would recommend for Albany? If you consider all these other factors, parking, which I believe will change in Albany within the next year or two, it's got to, and height limits, setbacks, et cetera, where would you put that one in particular? Because
we talked about this.
a lot of us are very uncomfortable with getting rid of commercial in a commercial
Yeah.
district that's right on the street.
I mean, there could be another hour conversation, but I think on that score, Albany's always been very flexible. You don't have a retail requirement. Oh, you do? Okay. Sorry, I take that back. I'm out of date. We talked about this. You know, there's functional reasons why you might not want to do that on a main thoroughfare, put the street level housing. I don't know where El Cerrito's proposing it. Is it on San Pablo directly?
Are you talking about the project right next to City Hall? That's going to have a health clinic on the ground floor. It's going to have like a community use, but it won't have, I believe it won't have residential on the ground floor. I think it's going to have.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there is an
Commercial
action in
component.
the Albany housing element to amend the zoning on San Pablo to allow ground floor residential if the project is affordable and a use permit is
I mean, it would be
requested.
great. I think it presents some there's some, it depends where, because, if you think about it, there are security issues for folks. I worked on a project long ago in downtown Oakland called Old Town Square, and the developer was originally from Philadelphia, and so he wanted that row house look with the steps right down the street. You guys are nodding your head. And I thought it was great because I come from the east, but Oakland staff said, "What are you doing in downtown Oakland?" And eventually they did build and it adds some nice character. You can also picture it maybe on side streets. So if you're on Solano and you could go around a corner, let's just say there's a hypothetical corner site. I mean, that's another way to think about it, to really kind of get a little more design creative and maybe put those entrances on the side. Anyway, I think it's good to get up to date on all
Well,
that.
and I know that the students are actually doing a design that actually does go down to the ground level, with the exception of Solano. Or of
San Pablo.
Of San Pablo.
Yeah, they're doing it on the
So,
sides, right?
I mean, it basically goes down, there's a variety of reasons that would make sense to do it outside of San Pablo itself. San Pablo really kind of depends where it is along San Pablo, whether or not it's a reasonable site or not.
But it shouldn't be a universal requirement. I mean, I'll make a plug the other way. It's great that general plan's looking at that.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi, thanks. This has been really great. I appreciate you all doing this. I have a question about our existing housing stock. We have a lot of apartment units in the city. Are there any kind of out-of-the-box ways of transitioning some of those apartment units to low-income housing, either by, when apartments become vacant, some programs that allow for subsidies for very low-income people, or something along those lines that would allow us to add low-income housing without having to deal with all the building issues we have?
I'm going to
Great question. I
They're really
want to make sure that
quick.
Tom gets a chance to respond to this one too, because San
Okay.
Leandro is doing exactly that with the rehab and acquisition program with the apartments.
go ahead.
I think that is something that infill cities, probably similar to yours, I mean, we face that, are looking at as option. I mean, and also with the future of funding right now somewhat bleak, potentially, you know, we've been thinking too that it's very hard for us to save up to build a new construction project. We also have limited land, similar to what you guys are facing. So, you know, we're often looking at utilizing some of our resources. We've had conversations with some landlords too, and what we do is try to say, look, we have some money for you to fix up your building. It's a little run down, you know, but if you're willing, you know, trying to get them to sort of lock into a longer term affordability guarantee for their residents, who often typically we think in some of those buildings could probably meet the income requirements. So, you know, not displacing them as well.
And acquisition rehab is not inconsistent with the California tax credit allocation system. So low-income tax credits are available, and there actually is another bond program that very often. I actually used one down in San Jose to do an acquisition rehab, and somebody asked about how long the residents had been there. Our average resident length was 19 and a half years.
Wow.
This was a 236 that was expiring. We had been owned since 1968, I believe.
Different affordable program.
Yeah, different affordable program, but actually probably more comparable because basically the rents float the same as they do a little bit in the tax credit program. And in that particular case, I think it was unusual, but literally it was like 17 and a half years was the average length of stay.
And if I could Barry just worked on this in our housing element. The private example I mentioned with the tax credits, we had a private developer from Southern California that bought an 840 unit apartment complex, which I didn't even realize existed until a few years ago. And they rehabbed it and made it affordable, so lowered the rents. And
all I was going to add is, I think it's a great question. The real challenge, what you're hearing is, so if you're going to get a funding source and you're going to income restrict, it's called, so that's guaranteed affordable to the right numbers, you got to buy the whole building. Somebody does. And somebody's got to agree, or the landlord has to agree that they will income restrict. It's sort of a form almost of rent control, so there's a lot of challenges doing it in a whole building. I just also want to say briefly, there's a whole other program we're not talking about that goes unit by unit, which is the other direction from the federal government, Section 8 voucher, which still gives some low-income families the ability for the federal government to pay the market rate rent for them. So there's another way to think about some of this too that's also still somewhat operative.
But I don't think rehab should be off the table.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to do that.
Okay, so it is just now 9 o'clock, so we are right on schedule to conclude the meeting. I do want to put in a plug for a couple of housing element hearings that are going to be coming up. We have a study session with the Planning Commission next Wednesday, October the 8th, right? And City Council on Monday the 20th, right, to consider the housing element. That will then go to the state of California and then come back to the city with state comments for adoption around December, January 2015. So we're moving forward with policies and action programs that I think are moving in the direction that our panelists have spoken about this evening. And I think we'll all stick around for a few minutes to field individual questions, but we're going to conclude the formal part of the meeting now. Again, want to thank our panelists for coming and thank all of you for coming as well. Good evening.